PhD were negotiated as potential pipelines for a spin-out company that Takeda took an interest in. So with that came the time where I was, in a bit of a crisis moment where I loved being a scientist, I loved the innovation side of things, but I knew I didn't want to be an academic scientist longer term. So pivoted career straight after my PhD and took on various roles within the medical research ecosystem, namely in commercialization and project management, where I helped support ecosystems and help other researchers commercialize their research. But it wasn't long that I then entered into the startups themselves. So I'm here as sort of like a hybrid person who's been a scientist, trained his entire life, had an identity crisis, then pivoted into the commercial side of things. So yeah, thank you again, and I'll hand over to Sheila to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sheila Fasil. I am a social change futurist and I'm a former healthcare executive turned tech founder, hence the sprouting of gray hair. So my background, I was actually trained in public health and started my career really at the community level, learning about how do we better serve patients. At the time, when I started my career, we were still dealing with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and hi, friend. And also, we're just kind of figuring out what it meant to roll out universal or some form of universal healthcare. So that's how I started my career, and where I ended up was working in various administrative and operations role inside of major health systems here in Boston, including Brigham, Dana-Farber, and lastly, Boston Medical Center, where my last role there was Director of Innovation for their Health Equity Accelerator. So my job really was to innovate from within a healthcare system, and if you've ever been to a hospital, we're not good at innovating at all. So of course, ran into a lot of barriers, but also had some interesting wins along the way. And now, as a tech founder, my company, Facilitate Change, we're an innovation studio, and we're developing better infrastructure for the healthcare space to innovate by starting with the voice of the patient. So you'll be hearing about a lot of that from me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Salazar. I'm the Senior Vice President of R&D Strategy and Operations, which is a mouthful for any startup. You get to wear multiple hats. So my career started, very similar to David's. I came out in the science space. I studied biomedical engineering because I was going to grow everyone a new pancreas. That was my vision. That was my goal. Everyone was going to have an organ that they could be replaced. But as you learn in academia, things don't always translate into business. And so the first company I actually did work for did actually start working in the tissue engineering space, but I was unsuccessful because the operational model just wasn't sustainable. And so moved more into the science, as a just kind of a bench scientist, moved, to project management, portfolio management, and really trying to find a space where I could be creative and problem solve. And so throughout my career, I went into kind of some smaller to medium biotechs, but also spent some time in larger pharma with like Pfizer, Takeda, and really kind of found my passion in oncology. And that is kind of where I've been for the past probably 10 to 15 years. And so really wanted to see how the science could be translated into something that impacted patients in the end. And so really having that goal of how do I impact patients? How do I make their lives better? You always strive to, how do you ultimately want to have the opportunity to cure cancer? And it's always a lofty goal, but even if you just, how do you get that mom or that dad to have, additional like 6 months, 12 months, years with their family, that is even just kind of a goal that you'd want to be able to achieve and be able to give that as a gift to patients who are suffering. So as I've kind of gone through my career, just kind of seeing different aspects of roles and responsibilities. And so now as a startup, you get to wear many hats. So everything from IT to the research team based in India. You have a little mix of everything, but it's you learn quickly, you adapt quickly, and I think it's just a very exciting space to be.
Thank you. And just to round things out, I'm Vanita Sood. I'm the head of drug discovery research at Fable Therapeutics, which is a small startup. I trained actually as a computational protein engineer, and from my postdoc went to a pharma company, EMD Serono. I actually spent 14 years there, so definitely appreciate pharma. But the whole time there, not the whole time, but towards midpoint onwards, was started to begin to wonder, well, what would it look like to be in an organization that had fewer stakeholders, fewer decision-making gatekeepers, the ability to be a bit nimble, the ability to take risks, So I think I see some smiles and nods, so probably a similar thought process has occurred with a few different people who've made the jump from big pharma or a corporate environment to a small startup. And so I made that jump about 3 years ago now, in 2022 to Fable Therapeutics, where we're applying machine learning to drug discovery in the obesity metabolic field. And it has been a wild ride. One of the things that I think that that decade plus in pharma really instilled in me was the ability to interact with people like Rachel. Actually, we overlapped at EMD Serono. And to have that holistic view on drug discovery, as well as like where is all that discovery science headed? It's headed to clinical development, So bringing that to bear in a startup environment, where, as Rachel said, we all have to wear multiple hats, is a real test of what one can learn in a more corporate environment, in a more self-regulated environment, but then applying it in a more nimble way. So it's been quite an interesting journey. But I think one of the major sort of takeaways from the time in big pharma, which I try to apply now in the startup environment, is keeping in mind the end while you're at the beginning. So that's the theme of today's session, lab to market. So thinking about the market, approval, commercialization, what have you, right from the beginning. And so with that, I want to dive into a few questions for our panelists. Right, so we, like all of you probably, have a company with a core value proposition, which might be a technology, it might be a platform, it might be a drug candidate. So how can one ensure, as you build your company, and develop that core asset that you have, that you're actually taking it in the right direction for eventual commercialization? So Sheila, I want to start with you. As the CEO of an innovation studio, and I took this from your website, that literally helps early stage startups design solutions that scale. Could you speak to us a little bit about what biotech and health tech founders and leaders should be doing at the very beginning of their journey to ensure that they're building something that the market actually wants?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I just want to get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you are scientists working in like a large corporation, mid-size, academia, startup? Okay, government, founder. Okay. Who are the rest of y'all? Why are you here? I'm trying to gauge the room a little bit.
Student. Biotech guy, finance.
Ah, okay. All right, good. Okay, so you're lovers of science. So I'll start by saying this. When we talk about science and innovation, as Vanita said, we have to really begin with the end in mind. And what that end looks like is like a patient is going to be ingesting or being injected with or being cut open and implanted with something you are building. And that patient, that person, right, has a story, has a lineage, has a family, has a very unique biology and genetics and history and relationships to healthcare. And I know that oftentimes when we think about innovation, we're thinking through all the red tape that we have to run through, right? Whether it's, okay, well, first we have to like figure out if this molecule does this thing in this specific pathway and can we replicate it? And then we test it in animals, then we test it in healthy humans, and then we have to do clinical trials, and those cost a lot of money, and then we have to get FDA approval. And I understand the complexities of all of those things, which is why I teach founders and folks in the life science space to design around product system fit. Product market fit is not enough when you are innovating in the life science or healthcare space, right? Because there's way too many stakeholders and players who are going to be touched by, affected by, or are important to implement the technology or the life science innovation that you're putting out in the world. And if we're not thinking about the system, which includes the patient, the caregiver, right? The doctor who has to prescribe the medication, the system administrator like myself who has to approve the budget for that tool or medication, right? The insurance company, all of those things have to be factored in. And of course, a lot of you have lived this, so you understand how complicated it is. But I will say this, if you never, ever, ever, if you don't remember anything else I say, remember this. Always start with the patient first as the first person that you're innovating and thinking through, right? If you never lose sight of the patient, then you build in the next layers of the system, and you have a much higher likelihood of succeeding and getting your product to market.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Rachel, I want to go to you next. So you have a long experience, as you said, in developing oncology drugs, and I think that applies to different therapeutic areas. So could you give us a little bit of your perspective on what biotechs can't speak today, typically get right, and what typical mistakes they might make when they're bringing a therapeutic drug from discovery all the way through to market approval by the FDA?
I like to say there's different, I guess, approaches to it when you think about different times in the market. I think if you looked, 5, 10 years ago, when you're thinking about, going out there and trying to get investments for your new company, everyone is investing in a platform. If you had a platform, even if it wasn't unproven, like, sure, I'll buy into it. And you've seen the pendulum swing a lot with this, where, a few years ago, everyone was kind of bitten by this, and you're like, okay, the investment community is very, cold on this aspect. They want to see clinical data. And so now you're a startup that is, has very limited funds, and they want to see something that costs millions of dollars from your investment. And how do you get there? How do you take, maybe small steps? How do you get grants? Or how do you build that funding to get you that point where they're going to be, okay, I have confidence to invest in this? And so at the very beginning, it is kind of what we've been talking about, is what problem are you solving for? What's your value proposition? And how can you best tell that story? Because it is about storytelling in a way. You have to be able to communicate, here's what I can offer you, and here's what is going to happen because I've, thought about the end, because that is at the end of it, the most important thing. And so going out there, you will get 1,000 no's before you get that first yes. And, if you're not willing to go through those 1,000 no's to get to that first yes, then that's going to be, a challenge for anyone who's willing to come in and do this startup, because it is a lot of work. It is a lot of time and effort, blood, sweat, and tears. But when you get that first yes, you really kind of start to see how it can kind of spiral, because the investment community is very, very much tied into one another, and they'll talk to their, folks who like, okay, I trust this other, investment VC, and they'll tell them. And so you can start building this early syndicate. And so really kind of ensuring that you are willing to go out and pound that pavement to get what you need to in order to get to that next, to that Series A, that Series B, because it does take a lot of effort. I think, if you're able to do that right, there's a lot of things that can, go wrong. Is just making sure that the people you work with early on have the same vision. Because a handful of people, you're up with 3, 4, 5, there's no hiding. Like, you are with these people for long hours constantly, and you all have to be heading in the same direction, have the same vision, have the same way you want to take this company forward, but at the same time have healthy debate and discussion. But if you are looking for things in two opposite directions, one looking to be, I want to get out of these, early phases, get the IPO and then sell, or I just want to have this early phase sold, prior to IPO. You just need it from a platform perspective. You all have to be on the same page. And I think that's an interesting space where certain companies have failed because their team isn't on the same page. And so having the right team with the same goals and same set of values, have how you want to operate in such a small group, is very important.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And maybe just picking up on something that both of you said is at the beginning, you have to start with that end in mind, right? The patient and that profile. And in all honesty, I know that that is a mistake that I made early in my career, which was to, privilege the science. But my science is so cool. This technology is so great. Who wouldn't want it, But actually, building the storytelling in, but not from your perspective, from the patient perspective. And then, Sheila, as you said, also the payer perspective and the system perspective. It's so important and something that, in my experience, a lot of us gloss over in the beginning. So staying on this theme, though, of what you need to think about at the beginning in order to have that success at the end, I want to move to you, David. You're currently involved not in one, but in two platform companies. So could you speak to us a little bit about the unique challenges in commercializing a platform technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier around that pendulum swinging, because I think I've been, I started my career in the biotech bubble where people were throwing money at anything. And now I'm starting to build a company in the space where they're not funding anything. So it's quite interesting to really be, almost, smacked in the face around what it is that actually matters at the end of the day when you're building a company. And big pharma companies, unfortunately, at the end of the day, they care about your asset because that's what they're going to be in licensing. That's what they're going to be, partnering with you for. And so at the end of the day, how you get there really doesn't matter. And unfortunately, it's really the platform and the science, the really good science, that gets you to that asset. But one thing that I guess I would say that platform companies are really exciting value propositions, at least to me as an entrepreneur. I feel like the opportunities are endless. You can really revolutionize the world with a platform. But I think the one thing that, platform companies invariably suffer from is a lack of focus. And the focus is towards asset generation in a way that's truly differentiated. I can name companies, but I won't, that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars only to not even have a phase 1 asset ready to go or test, purely because they sort of raised on the hype of AI. And I say this as an AI company, so keep that in mind as well. So I think that one thing that's really important for founders and teams to get aligned on early on is to identify what that core value proposition is, or what is that core point of differentiation within your platform that allows you to selectively go after certain disease targets that other platforms might not be able to. And if you're in a position where that core point of differentiation is patentable, then fantastic, patent it. But there are plenty of times, especially in the AI quantum space, which is where we operate, unfortunately, it's all trade secret. There is really nothing that can be patented from a platform perspective, because you're going to lose the prior art argument come, patent enforcement time. So really identify what is that core point of value, that core value proposition, and really start to identify, okay, using that core point of differentiation, which subset of targets or which clear areas of unmet medical need can we really go after using that core point of differentiation. And move as quickly as possible as you can to develop assets that you can then file patents on based on these differentiated targets. Because as smart as anyone in this room likes to think that they are, if you trade secret something, short of being Coca-Cola or Pepsi, well, it happened to Coca-Cola, so why am I even using that example? Short of, being able to identify something that is really difficult to, conjure up, essentially, you will be leapfrogged at some point. Someone will come onto the same observation you did and start to develop a platform company of their own. So at Pending AI, which is the company, that I'm here representing today, we have this unique element of adopting AI and quantum mechanics together to help unlock a scalability challenge around how to apply quantum mechanics in today's drug discovery pipelines without having to resort to quantum computing. So we're sort of acting as that bridge between now and when quantum computing becomes ubiquitous. But we are certainly not operating under the assumption that will be, we will be the only company capable of doing that in the next 3 years. years. So we've really gone out, we've really tested the market, we've asked drug discovery scientists, look, we've got this capability, where would you see it? And we kept getting the same answer time and time again. And so now we're just essentially trying to tackle that. So in operating a platform company, I think it is really important to focus, develop programs that are differentiated. And the important thing to recognize as well is that that gives you optionality. Because when times are tough, and say you do have an asset that you can push into a phase one, you can still not necessarily go under as a company. You can just pivot, your focus into the development of that asset. So it gives you that degree of optionality where if you only have the platform and you've got nothing to really show for it, come the hard times, invariably companies collapse. So sorry if that was a long-winded answer, but yeah, hope that provides some perspective.
Yeah, I think that was really great advice. And linking that to something Rachel said, I think in platform companies with a very good and cutting-edge technology, you often have this initial tension between what are we selling here? Are we selling our technology, or are we selling what the technology can do? And so what you're saying is, if you're selling what the technology can do it, show it, right? But linking back to what you said, Rachel, it's really important that in that small team, everybody has that vision, that shared vision, that you're using it as the tool to show what can be done. But obviously, David, you and I talked about this before, like there are companies that have been successful selling the core technology. I brought up Schrödinger, and you had something interesting to say about that example, so maybe you can share that as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, like I guess the sassy comment I made back was, well, even Schrödinger is becoming a therapeutics company now. So like, I feel like Schrödinger is certainly like it's a beacon on a hill. Like they've done incredibly well to sell software and sell their capabilities and stay ahead of the market. But if you ask me to mention any other company that provides those tools at that scale, I can probably mention like companies like Benchling that are doing really well, selling ELNs, but like I would struggle to sort of name companies after that. So like I do think it is important that, it is a business model question at the end of the day. But one thing I forgot to mention during my answer was the idea of building a startup company, especially in the pharmaceutical space. Ultimately, you want to be partnering with big pharma to get non-dilutive funding in the door. You want to be able to convince investors that this is commercially viable. And what I mentioned earlier around the development of differentiated assets starts to develop a bit of a flywheel effect in a positive feedback loop, that if you can prove that your platform can generate differentiated assets, then pharma starts to get interested, then investors start to get interested, and around and round. So a competitor of ours, well, they're not necessarily a competitor because we're using similar technologies. There's a company called Iambic Therapeutics, and I've sort of taken my hat off to them because that's exactly what they did. Like they had a platform that was AI and QM integrated. They went after development of 3 targets, and they were just laser focused. Then they raised their round. Then now they're starting to broker partnerships with a range of different pharma companies because they're like, we've developed this differentiated capability. So if you're looking for a case study of how this works really well, I would certainly point to them.
Okay, great. So I think that's a good point to segue at. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different considerations or skill sets or mindsets that you might need at different stages of your startup journey. So it can look quite different if you're at the seed startup stage versus more mature. So I want to start with either Sheila or David. You guys both have some overlapping background. So what advice do you have for researchers at the very beginning that are seeking to spin out a company from their academic institute?
So I had the privilege to actually support physician scientists who have started doing clinical trials and have become primary investigators and want to grow their portfolio and branch out. Now, doing clinical trials in an academic institution where you have supports and it's 10% of your time is very different than when you're doing it all the time, right? And now you're taking on the role of not just being the scientist, but also the operations person, the marketing person, the finance person, all the things that come with running a business, right? And making something profitable. But I will say there's one thing that I see that really unlocks and accelerates people's success, and it is a radical acceptance of I don't know and having that humility to say it, and then looking for people who are different than you, who can come in and ask different questions or provide different perspectives so that you're able to then find the answers that you're looking for. Yes, I am talking about diversity. It is important, especially in the life science space, not just because we want to have different genders and ethnicities and races represented, it's because science is advanced when we ask better questions and different questions. And every single one of us bring a very different perspective to how we think about the science and how we think about the business and how we navigate difficulty, right? So when you embed that into the way that you think and into the team that you're building from day one, you have a much higher likelihood of being able to survive those turbulent times, being able to survive uncertainty, which is inevitable in the space of building something from scratch, right? That's never existed before.
Yeah, once again, we see team as emerging as a core theme. And Rachel, you said earlier it's really important to be pulling together, but I definitely agree with Sheila. You got to be pulling together while challenging each other and bringing those different perspectives. Before we go to the other end of the life cycle, David, do you want to add anything for this part of the life cycle? If you're right at the beginning, you're ready to spin something out.
Yeah, absolutely. So like my, first core piece of advice I always give to everyone that approaches me with a cool idea and they want to start a company. For me, this might sound trivial, but you would be shocked at the value that this approach brings. It's really about starting where you are, which is really day one. You may have spent 10 years on the science, but unfortunately in your commercial journey, it is day one. And that you have a 10-year, 15-year journey ahead of you. And there's going to be a whole range of different stakeholders that you need to interact with throughout that entire journey to be able to make things work well. And don't think that just because, the FDA is a 10-year problem, therefore I don't need to consider my regulatory strategy or need to interact with them. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. So what I often advise people to do is to essentially map out all their different stakeholders and start to make some assumptions around what it is that their platform or their capability or their discovery can actually achieve in the market, and go and speak to at least 5 to 10 in sort of the first round of each of these different stakeholder types and put it in front of them. Be able to say, look, I'm thinking this regulatory strategy. What do you think? And invariably you'll find in your first round that you probably get everything wrong. And that's okay. But the idea is that you continually test it with the market. And this is not something you do on day one and stop. This is something that you continue to do over time with your company. But it serves as a really good starting point to be able to start to mature your thinking in terms of what the market and what commercial people actually are looking for. And I'll give you one really clear example. Again, I won't name company names, but this is a real story that actually happened. So there was a company that was building a portable imaging system that they thought, fantastic, why do we need all these large multi-million-dollar imaging systems inside hospitals when we can just wheel something to the patient's bedside? And on the face of it, that sounds like an amazing idea. It's like, let's just miniaturize the technology. We can do more scans. Fantastic. Like, that sounds like a really good idea. Ultimately, that company went all the way to IPO. So, they exited, right? But the problem was that they didn't speak to one core stakeholder throughout their entire journey, and that was the radiologist, who has to, after you scan 5 or 10 times at each patient as opposed to one a day, those are the poor people that have to actually write up the reports around what the images actually say. And so by not actually appreciating that stakeholder within the system, comes back to your framework earlier, that when they tried to sell into the National Health Service, for example, the NHS radiologist walked off the job because they're just like, no way, you don't buy, either triple our staff or we're just going to walk off the job. And so that would have, they could have course corrected with one conversation early on with the right stakeholder. So I think it's really important to make sure that all of these individuals within your commercialization journey are accounted for.
Yeah, and I think that is one thing that's unique about biotech and health tech is there are some really important, strong stakeholders like physicians, like payers, like the FDA. So definitely good to keep in mind. Early, but also late. So Rachel, one of the things that I'm like very curious about, because I haven't had gone that far as you have with your companies, you've been through the full cycle. And you've had that transition from private company, privately financed, to publicly traded. So at that moment in a company's life cycle, what kind of advice do you have for people about the skill sets, mindsets they might need when they're making that transition?
Yeah, I think we started off as a company, and I joined a little over 5 years ago, and we were 7 people at that point. But we were going to be targeted tumor modulators, so bifunctionals, and that was kind of how we wanted to start, solving some of these problems. Like, we know that there's potential for immune responses, but there's this other mechanism we have to target. So that's how we started evolving. And in this biotech winter, we were out there getting funding, and soon learned that, okay, our pipeline can't exist. We have to pivot, and we have to focus on one asset. So we now become instead of a company that's going to have a bunch of assets in the pipeline. In order to conserve cash runway, we have to think about that long-term plan. In order for me to generate that next point of data that can give me that next cash infusion or take me to that next stage in company growth, what people do I need to get me there? What connections do I need to start making in order to take me to that next point in development? And like you said, it's not just the financiers who are going to be giving you the money. It's the plan that you have behind it. So it is those OLs, those are like the KOLs, the payers, the different folks that you need to have integrate and have them tell you what they're hearing, because they also have these connections and within the community that, oh, we hear that your data's not coming till later, like these things that you hear, like, well, where did you hear that? It is kind of a little bit of a sewing circle at times, because you have competition out there, and as you're thinking about, again, the end in mind, how is your asset going to fit into this competitive landscape? It can't just be I have exciting science, like you said. It's like, okay, there's 3 or 4 other assets out there that look similar to mine. So how am I going to be different? Am I going to only go after a certain portion of that population and really kind of make a big impact and say, all right, this, what they call precision medicine approach is going to get me a bigger impact and more excitement around my asset, rather than just having mediocre data in the same population. So as you think about growing, we started with our series, I joined with the Series A. As we moved to Series B, again, it was just that clinical data that started showing, okay, there's value in this asset. What's the next data point? You have more data, you're out there, but then you're trying to weave that. When is it the right time to go in the IPO? Do you do it now? Do you do it later? What does the market look like? What's the environment? It's an election year. You don't know what the markets are going to do. So there's so many different aspects you have to consider when going into that IPO phase. So a good CFO who knows how to understand the markets and what to do and when to do it, a CEO who has a good vision, your CSO who's been with you from the beginning, who's like the part of the science, who still takes you through it. Like, these folks who are going to be in those driver's seats to get you to that next phase are going to be very important. So once you get to that phase prior to IPO, building that syndicate who will stay with you after. And that's really important, because you can always see those investors who might get in, leaves like immediately after, and then your value's gone. So what syndicate you start building prior to the IPO is going to be important, because getting the folks who are going to be there with you after and continue to support you because they believe in the company is important to kind of that long-term sustainability and to be able to keep that cash runway to actually get your drug to the market.
Yeah, once again, team is key.
Yes.
So I'm learning a few things here. I'm taking a few mental notes. So one of the other things you said that I took a mental note on is, that value proposition. It's really, nobody cares what Vanita thinks is great about her company or her asset. It's about getting in the KOLs, the external opinion. And that is something that even at the Series A stage, I learned, like, I think I'm pretty smart, but nobody cares. By nobody, I mean investors. They don't care what I think. They care what the expert thinks about my company. So, yeah, definitely important, and yeah, interesting that it doesn't get less important the more
No, it
mature
actually
you go.
becomes more important, because these, your IR person becomes a very important person in these meetings, because they're the ones who, once you have folks reporting on your company saying, whether to buy or sell, like, these are the folks who are putting the data out or saying, here's why I think, buy car is a good buy, or here's why I think you should sell. And if you think you're the only ones talking to them, like, that's the biggest mistake. Your competition is already trying to sometimes see it against you. Like, well, they might have good data, but those patients were really healthy and really good, and it really is not going to be successful. Like, there's always counter positioning, so you always have to get ahead of that. And so I would toss in investor relations as well, because the positioning out there as you get later becomes more and more critical.
Amazing. So we've talked a lot about what founders and leaders need to do and think about, thinking early about what your end is, having the right skill sets. Let's talk a little bit about where they can turn to for support. So the Boston ecosystem in particular has a lot of resources, and it's a really vibrant ecosystem that can potentially facilitate your journey from lab to market. So Sheila, I want to start with you because you've been embedded in this Boston ecosystem for a pretty long time. So maybe you can just share your views on different resources or where people can turn to for support or learning.
Yeah, I don't think this is news to anyone. This is definitely the healthcare life science hub of probably America, if not the world. So many universities and institutions that are investing in science. There's a few that I think are doing exceptional things, and organizations that are providing professional support and runways, including MassBio, which is a great organization to be part of. I've also had the privilege of being able to collaborate with Lab Central, where they're helping very early stage biotech and life science companies to incubate. Is it can be very costly, right, to build these companies, whether you're thinking about the science, the technology, the equipment, the bench space, whatever it might be. And I don't know how many of you have a rich uncle that can give you $1 million to get started, right? So you definitely want to find those spaces that will allow you to really invest in learning while they've already set up that environment and infrastructure for you. There's many more that exist. I would also look at corporations that have innovation hubs like Johnson & Johnson, where they are looking to invest in people and often have opportunities for you to come in and further their science and the opportunities that exist there. I also just wouldn't underestimate the power of collaboration. I know some of the there's a lot of ego that comes with being a scientist, right? In terms of this thing and you have the answer and you've done the triple PhD, right? But there is a power that comes with collaborating with people that are solving similar problems or in the same space as you, that you can kind of put your minds together and put your resources together. So I really wouldn't underestimate the power of collaboration as well.
So I think we have, I'm going to open up to general questions in the audience in a moment, so think about your questions. But before we leave this topic, David, you've come from farther away, and so you have like a little bit of an outside-in perspective on the Boston ecosystem, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, so I guess coming from Australia, there's a reason why I sort of gave up everything and moved to the opposite side of the world. And it was to be, as you say, in the largest biotech and pharma hub in the world. So I think it's an exceptional privilege to be here and to build companies within this biotech hub. But I guess the one thing I will say is that, coming from Australia, Australia on an objective level has world-class science. You take a look at the publication metrics, all of that sort of thing, and Australia definitely, hits above its weight. But fundamentally, where it falls apart is that next step of, hey, I need 5 million to get this up and running. Just to give you an idea of how small the ecosystem is, I think there are 3 healthcare VCs in all of Australia that could write you a check like that. So, and I can go walking and get 100x that within this ecosystem. So, so I think that the one thing that it did do was it actually, fortunately enough, positioned me quite well to operate in this biotech winter, because in Australia you have to achieve value inflection points as cheaply as possible, essentially. Like, you have to make your dollar go and stretch so much further. So yeah, so I'll leave my thoughts at that. But I think the one thing that, even in spite of the biotech winter, I think that anyone who is building a healthcare company here, should, I guess, take stock of the graces of, how amazing this ecosystem is, how many partners are in that positive flywheel that I was mentioning earlier. Pharmaceutical company headquarters, innovation arms, Harvard, MIT investors. It's just that Boston has done this very, very well, and it's a model ecosystem that everyone around the world is trying to replicate at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Any questions from the audience? Oh, yeah, got a couple there. And maybe if people feel like it, you don't have to, but you could say your name and what your role is and before your question. Up to you.
Thank you. Roy Wallen, I work with biotech startups. So I applaud the comments about building a team. I think it's critical. Sheila, especially, you talked about building a diverse team. There's great data to support the notion that diverse teams do better than homogeneous teams. So I'm a big fan of that. But working with scientists and especially physicians who have great science, a great idea, and think they can do everything. I'm sure there's no one in this room that feels that way, but they do exist. And how do you convince someone who's got great science, a world-class reputation, that they can't do it all, that they need to build a team around them, that they wouldn't know a spreadsheet from a pothole? And yet they need to understand what those differences are. And you can build a business purely on research funding, or at least you used to be able to. And I've seen people do that successfully, but you can't go to market and you can't build a commercially successful company just by the science or just by the medicine. How do you convince those smart scientists that they need help?
That's a great question. So, I mean, pain convinces people in a lot of ways, like failure. And I think we're definitely in an environment where we're gonna have a lot more ouches, right? When there's less of that cushion. And the reality is settling in about the changes that are happening with funding and regulations, right? And I'll also kind of like keep this very real. Something that I see happens in life sciences way too much is we tolerate competent jerks. It is not okay to do that anymore. We're not living in a time where just because you're brilliant, you're allowed to treat people and do things and say things to people just because you're brilliant. And people have whole spreadsheets figuring out how to manage you. Like, that's not okay, and that's not a good use of anyone's time. We need teams and scientists that are nimble, efficient, open-minded, and most importantly, humble. So I would challenge all of you, just don't work with them, right? there is plenty of brilliance out there. So stop tiptoeing around people who have all this pedigree and degrees, but like you said, don't know the difference between a spreadsheet and a pothole. They shouldn't be doing that work then. But when we continue to tolerate the behavior and allow them to behave in these ways and still be on the team, they're not getting the message that that's not okay.
One question over here and then over there.
Hi, everyone.
I,
It's-
it's
I
on.
think we can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, sorry. My name's Seth. I have a startup in oncology. And, I think a lot of the talk was about cohesive teams. And I think to an extent, investors are part of those teams. And I know, Rachel, you were also talking about how, investments getting quite cold, especially on platforms, and everyone wants to see clinical data. So the number of investors who are looking at early stage companies is very, very limited, I would say, and a lot of them are jerks, like you were saying, Sheila. So my question is, how do you find the right investor? And what's the right stage to go looking for investment, either equity investment or pharma partnerships? And how do you avoid those people coming in and really damaging the company vision or changing the company vision?
I think like I said, it depends really kind of on your environment. I think we started off with like, well, we're not getting the investments. Now maybe we do a SPAC and a pipe, kind of take that different approach in investment, or, how do we get the funding? The biggest advantage was that I think with the leadership was the network, like the network that they created, that they spent time talking to people. JP Morgan, they didn't care who was like, whether they were, Rajiv at the head of Fidelity, they're going to go talk to him. They were going to go and make the connections. And if they didn't have the connection, they were going to find someone to make them get the connection. But the flip side of that is making sure you have a board, an investment syndicate that is going to be, again, supportive of the vision like that you've communicated. This is what we want to take, this company to. And they're not going to start forming these pockets of little alliances of, well, this group versus that group. You get a good sense of that when they're coming in and talking to you. Some of them won't give you the time of day. They're on their phone as you're giving your pitch, and you're like, okay, they're not here for the science. They're just taking this as a favor or something. But I'm coming back 3 months from now. I'm coming back 6 months from now, because eventually they might actually wake up to the data and see that's investment. There was one group that we came back at least 3 or 4 times, and they're like, I wish we could have gotten in earlier. And you're like, you feel vindicated at the end. I'm like, I told you. But it's that tenacity that you eventually get that, like I said, the first few, and then, okay, if you find an investor you really kind of want to partner with, they like seeks like. And so that these different investors who have worked together before, like, I have a good investment for you. You'll get that good group. But if you start kind of seeding it with folks who are like, I'm here to kind of take advantage of the situation, and again, like will seek like, you'll have a few others who are going to be in that same boat. So it's really kind of sniffing that out at the very beginning. You're like, okay, are they here for just like, I'm going to get in, get out, and make my money, or am I really going to invest in the team, in the company, and see this long term? So those things you have to just really kind of be cognizant of at the beginning.
Yeah, and I might just add to that, having a pretty good set of investors for Fable and seeing how it was done. One thing I learned was, like, in the first year of Fable, we didn't have a CEO, and our seed funder, Versant Ventures, they were great. They had the network that Rachel talked about that was really important, but they weren't dedicated to our companies. They have a whole portfolio of companies, right? 1 year in, we hired a CEO who had the network and was only working for us, not a whole suite of, and oh my God, like I realized that I had, as a scientist, undervalued that skill set, but it was just amazing. So like, stuff I won't go on, but yeah, get a good CEO early on because scientists are not good CEOs. That is what David, you want to say?
Can I just
and
make
then
one
we'll
quick
go to
comment?
the
Yeah.
corner there.
One quick comment that I'll make as well is that I think it's important to make sure that, especially in these early conversations, that you and the investor are very well aligned in terms of what it is that your company looks like and how it's going to grow moving forward. Because I think that that often gets left after investment, and then they're sitting on your board, and then these things start to happen. And so that's the worst time for that to start happening, because then there's conflicts that arise. So I think it is really important to stress test and make sure that you're aligned, even on the longitudinal vision, and getting their perspective on what it is that they need. It's do they need an exit in the next 5 years because their fund is closing in 5 years? Okay, well then what does that look like for your company? And being able to, I guess, stand your ground a little bit, not necessarily have this weird power dynamic that even I fell into, plenty of times. And just making sure that you view this as a productive relationship, because it has to be. They're going to continue to pour capital into your company. They're going to have other people pour capital into the company, and you're going to have to work with them longer term. So I think that's just one thing that I would mention. And then the second thing I would mention as well, that I don't think a lot of people necessarily do, is go and speak to the founders or the C-suite leadership of companies that they've invested in. Go and do a little bit of due diligence on these investors, because I think that founders are always open to talking to other founders. And one, you can get a perspective on who their investors are. And if, that's a great relationship, then they might be able to refer you. And so it saves you coming in as a cold lead, that you're getting referred from an existing portco, and they're willing to take it a lot more seriously because they've already got that existing relationship that they need to manage. So I just wanted to make those 2 points before we moved on, but yeah, hope that helps.
There's a question in the corner, if we can get the mic. Oh, there's, okay. Okay, so we'll go to the back, and then you've had your hand for a while.
Hi, my name is Austin Morsey. My goal is to bring private funding and focused research efforts into the RNA therapeutic space. I'm curious if you can discuss, how do you choose successful external partners? For example, Sheila, you brought up this idea that diversity is a pragmatic necessity for doing good science. In this regard, I could see the benefit of, for example, selecting an international contract research organization to carry out your pilots. However, whether you're working with an international CRO or domestic CRO, how do you go about ensuring there's scientific integrity in the data that's generated, that's not done by your hands, when there's a financial incentive to perhaps tell you a story that you want to hear?
Do you want me to answer that? So one thing I do, this comes up quite a bit when I talk about diversity, is that we, and I'm not saying that this is you, there's an automatic assumption that we're getting less quality, right? So I want to challenge that first, because the incentive you've mentioned, everyone has that incentive, regardless of whether they're domestic or international, right? So then it comes down to your culture and how you build those relationships and what policies you have in place, and how do you build transparency, and how do you bring people along so that your interests and your values are aligned, right? And that's how business in general should be done, right? You're gonna find people that are gonna do shady things domestically as well as people internationally. You're gonna do shady things. It's gonna be all about your due diligence, right? And making sure that you're having those upfront conversations. And I do want to circle back to my earlier comment, in case some of you were surprised by competent jerk. I did not come up with that term. I learned that at Harvard, okay, in an executive training class. And the reason why I bring that up in this space, and all of you are brilliant butterflies, none of you are competent jerks, is because I do make a point of addressing the elephant in the room, because science is ultimately about people, right? You are people. You are all people with heartbeats and families and stories, and you're doing wonderful things for other people. So we can never lose sight of the fact that we are people doing our best, and we have to learn from our past mistakes and do better next time, okay?
Gentleman in the corner.
Great. Hi everyone. My name is Todd Benjamin. My question is really for each of you. I'd love to hear your thoughts as to maybe what are the 2 or 3 biggest hindrances that you see in the lab that are preventing treatments from getting to patients faster and less expensively.
Okay, let's start with David.
Yeah, I'll take the I'll take the faster point. I think that invariably there is a big issue that arises when you're building an earlier stage company, and like although like I absolutely love this about early stage companies, that there's like a bit of blue sky. You like to rapidly iterate, and you need to move as quickly as possible, but there needs to, like, at least I found in my experience, not talking about any specific company, that a degree of project management or a degree of framework to help sort of herd the cats towards a single direction is one thing that invariably gets lost. And so with that comes a lot of, sub-themes, like being able to make sure that everyone's aligned on the same goal, making sure that next steps are appropriately communicated as it relates to the broader project and the broader goal. And this can lead to, just even the most minor things that it's like, in the meeting you say this person will hand that data over to this person. And then you have a meeting the week later and they just said, oh, did you say that? So it's just like even trivial stuff like that, like I just find like sometimes I just like, so yeah, like I would just say, especially in these earlier stage companies, being able to provide some degree of structure. Like you don't want enterprise grade structure to things, but you need to have like some sort of coherence to what's going on.
Good. Sheila, we're running up the clock and I want to make sure.
The science needs to work in real life. If y'all remember during COVID, when the vaccines came out, some of them had to be held in like sub-degree temperatures. And one of the biggest challenges we had in hospitals was like, well, how do we even do that? So just because your technology works in a lab doesn't mean it'll work in real life. So please think about that up front.
Rachel.
I think for us is if you can stay as lean as possible in your company, stay as lean as possible. I think we started our pivotal trial and we had 15 people in our company. And every time we talked with a pharma, they're like, you only have 15 people in your company? My team is 45 people trying to do the same thing. And so, again, it's about, the team and finding that those people who all have the same kind of goal in mind.
And I'll just add briefly, my tip for keeping the lab real is you're not writing a publication, you're trying to make a drug, so listen to the people who've made the drugs and then decide which experiments to do, because we don't care about the cool ones. I guess that's us out of time.
Yeah. A huge thank you to our speakers. We have a lot more in store for both today and the rest of the week. There are a lot of different side events happening throughout the city tonight, including a pub crawl, if you're all interested in. However, if you're interested in staying in this building, we also have a Massachusetts Climate Tech Studio Final Showcase happening on the first floor. And otherwise, we know you want to mingle after this event. We definitely encourage it. However, we do ask you to slowly leave the room because we need to prepare this room for our next session. If you're joining us virtually, you don't need to go anywhere. Just choose the next session on the schedule and we'll be back shortly. But otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of Startup Week Boston.